60-degree bay water tastes of cheap diesel and salt when it floods your nose. High above, a Navy SEAL stood with his chest puffed, riding an adrenaline spike after violently shoving a frumpy middle-aged nurse off the pier. He thought he was securing his training zone. He actually just drowned his entire career. Vice Admiral Patricia Kelly did not look like a 3-star admiral. She looked like a woman who hadn't slept since Thursday. It was 05:30 on a Tuesday in Coronado. The marine layer hung thick and low over the San Diego Bay, a damp, heavy blanket that muted the sounds of the waking naval base. Kelly sat on a rusted mooring bollard at the edge of Pier 4. She wore faded blue scrubs, washed so many times the fabric had lost its structure, and an oversized, unbranded grey fleece. Her greying hair was pulled back into a messy, utilitarian knot. No stars, no ribbons, no aides hovering with clipboards, just a nurse staring at the black water. 2 hours earlier, she had been standing in the ICU at the Naval Medical Center. A 20-year-old machinist's mate had gotten his leg caught in a winch cable during a night evolution on a destroyer. Kelly had spent her entire adult life trying to put broken kids back together. 30 years ago, she was packing gauze into blast wounds in dusty tents. Now, she commanded the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery. She drafted policy. She argued with politicians over budgets. She fought wars in sterile rooms under fluorescent lights. But sometimes, she just needed the cold air. She needed to smell the salt and the diesel fuel and remind herself what the fleet actually felt like. Pier 4 was technically an auxiliary pier, shared jurisdiction between base logistics and naval special warfare. On Tuesday mornings, before 0600, it was dead. It was hers. She held a styrofoam cup of terrible burnt coffee from the hospital cafeteria. The heat of it seeped through the cheap foam, warming her calloused hands. She watched a seagull pick at a discarded candy wrapper near the edge of the concrete. "I'm getting too old for the politics," she whispered to the bird. The gull ignored her. Down the shoreline, the rhythmic, synchronized thud of combat boots hit the pavement. A cadence barked in a sharp, aggressive baritone cut through the fog. Kelly didn't turn her head. She knew the rhythm. SEALs, the Navy's apex predators. She respected them, patched them up, and occasionally buried them. She also knew they possessed an ego roughly the size of an aircraft carrier. The boots grew louder. A squad of 8 men jogged out of the grey mist, moving in perfect unison, carrying a Zodiac inflatable boat on their heads. The rubber creaked under the strain of their grips. Sweat poured down their faces, mixing with the damp coastal air. Leading them was Lieutenant Wyatt Miller. Miller was 28, built like a brick wall, and currently running on 3 hours of sleep, excessive pre-workout powder, and the desperate need to prove he was the hardest man on the West Coast. He was running a remedial physical training session for his squad. Someone had slacked off during a room-clearing drill the day before. Miller believed in pain as a teacher. He believed in dominance. He believed Pier 4 was his. He called a halt. The men stopped on a dime. The boat lowered to the concrete with a heavy, wet slap. Miller wiped the sweat from his eyes and looked down the length of the pier. He saw the rusted bollards. He saw the rolling grey water. And he saw a middle-aged woman in a frumpy fleece, sipping coffee. His jaw tightened. The base was crawling with civilian contractors, spouses who wandered too far, and hospital staff looking for shortcuts. Miller despised them all. They lacked discipline. They lacked situational awareness. They were soft. "Hey!" Miller barked, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal of the nearby storage hangars. Kelly took a slow sip of her coffee. She didn't look up. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the faint glow of dawn was just beginning to break through the marine layer. "Hey, lady," Miller called out, louder this time, his boots closing the distance between them. "You're in my training footprint." Kelly finally turned her head. She looked at him with the calm, dead-eyed assessment of a woman who had once told a screaming, bleeding Marine to shut up so she could save his life. She took in Miller's tense posture, the aggressive set of his shoulders, the vein throbbing slightly in his neck. "Good morning, Lieutenant," Kelly said, her voice quiet, gravelly, and entirely unimpressed. Miller stopped a few feet away. He loomed over her. He didn't ask how she knew his rank. He just assumed she noticed the silver bar pinned to his damp patrol cap. This is a restricted area, naval special warfare only. Is it? Kelly asked gently. I was under the impression Pier 4 is shared logistics, open to all personnel with a TS clearance or higher until 0600. It is currently 0542. Miller's eyes narrowed. He hated bureaucrats. He hated civilians who read the base rulebook just to be annoying. I don't care what time it is. My guys are running an evolution. You're a safety hazard. I need you to clear the pier. Now. Kelly looked down at her styrofoam cup. It was half empty. I'll be gone in 10 minutes. Work around me. Behind Miller, the 7 men of his squad stood in silence. They were exhausted, but their eyes tracked the exchange. A seasoned chief petty officer at the back of the formation shifted his weight. The chief squinted at the woman on the bollard. Something about her stillness bothered him. People usually flinched when Miller yelled. This woman didn't even blink. I'm not asking, Miller said, taking a step closer. He was close enough now that Kelly could smell the stale sweat and the acrid tang of adrenaline radiating off him. You're a civilian, in a hard-hat area. You're out of uniform. You have no ID displayed, and you are obstructing a military operation. You're running a boat carry, Lieutenant, not invading Normandy, Kelly replied dryly. And I'm not a civilian. Then you're insubordinate, Miller snapped. He was losing face in front of his men. The frustration boiled over into a sudden, blinding spike of anger. He reached out, grabbing Kelly by the shoulder of her fleece. I said, get off my pier. Physical contact changes everything. It is a line drawn in the sand, and once crossed, all previous rules of engagement dissolve. When Miller's heavy, calloused hand clamped onto Kelly's shoulder, a profound silence descended on the pier. The screeching of the seagulls seemed to mute. The splashing of the waves against the pilings faded. The only sound was the sharp intake of breath from the chief, standing 20 yards away. Kelly froze. She didn't pull away. She didn't swat his hand. She simply turned her head and stared down at the large fingers digging into her grey fleece. Remove your hand, she said. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped. It became a flat, dead frequency. Miller felt a strange, cold prickle at the base of his neck. His instincts, honed by years of combat training, screamed at him that he had just grabbed a live wire. But his pride was louder. He was an officer in the SEAL teams. He was 28 years old, physically invincible, and used to absolute compliance. Backing down to a frumpy hospital worker in front of his squad was not an option. Walk away, Miller commanded, tightening his grip, or I will physically remove you from this installation. You are making a mistake, Lieutenant, Kelly said softly. She looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no fear in her gaze, only a clinical, dissecting pity. A catastrophic one. That look broke something in Miller. It was the look of a disappointed parent, a superior officer, a judge. It infuriated him. He didn't think. He just reacted. I said, get off my pier. He shoved her. It wasn't a gentle push. It was a violent, dismissive shove, driven by frustration and the mechanics of a man who spent 3 hours a day in the weight room. Kelly was a woman in her late 50s. She was tough, but she was not heavy. The force of the shove lifted her off her feet. She stumbled backward, her boots scraping violently against the wet concrete. She tried to catch her balance, her arms windmilling for a fraction of a second. The styrofoam cup flew from her hand, a spray of brown coffee arcing through the morning fog. Her heel caught the metal lip of the pier's edge. For a terrible, suspended second, she hung in the air. She made no sound. She didn't scream. She just looked at Miller, her eyes wide with a sudden sharp clarity before gravity took over. She fell backward into the void. Splash. The sound of her hitting the water was heavy and final. A plume of white spray shot up over the edge of the concrete, dampening the rusted metal. Miller stood there, his chest heaving. He stared at his own hands, breathing hard. He felt a sudden, rushing high of victory, quickly followed by a sickening drop in his stomach. He had done it. He had cleared his area. But the reality of what he had just physically done, throwing a woman into the ocean, began to seep through the adrenaline. "Lieutenant!" The chief broke from the formation, his boots slamming against the concrete. He ran to the edge of the pier, peering down into the churning grey water. The drop was a good 15 feet. The water in the bay was cold enough to shock the lungs, cold enough to induce panic in someone who wasn't expecting it. "What the hell did you just do, sir?" the chief demanded, turning his head to glare at Miller. The respect inherent in the rank was entirely absent from his tone. "She was trespassing," Miller said, his voice defensive. He walked to the edge, looking down. She wouldn't comply. Down in the water, the darkness was absolute for a few terrifying seconds. The cold hit Kelly like a physical blow to the chest. It drove the breath from her lungs in a sharp, involuntary gasp. The salty, diesel-tainted water rushed into her mouth and nose. The weight of her wet fleece instantly became a lead anchor, dragging her down into the freezing depths. "Panic," her brain suggested. "Thrash. Scream." "No," her training answered. 32 years in the Navy. Survival courses. Heaps of trauma. She had been shot at in helicopters. She wasn't going to drown in a harbour. Kelly forced her eyes open. The water stung, murky and green. She kicked her legs, shedding the initial shock, and stroked toward the surface. She broke the water with a gasp, violently coughing up seawater. She wiped her face, treading water heavily as the soaked fleece dragged at her shoulders. She looked up. 15 feet above, Miller and the chief were looking down at her. "Hey!" Miller yelled down, his voice carrying a nervous edge now. "Swim to the ladder! It's 20 yards to your left!" Kelly didn't answer him. She didn't waste the oxygen. She simply locked eyes with him, treading water with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The anger burning inside her chest was hot enough to boil the ocean around her. She turned her body and began swimming toward the rusted metal rungs embedded in the concrete pilings. "I'll go get her," the chief said, his face pale. He began to strip off his tactical vest. "Stand down, chief!" Miller snapped, though his voice lacked its previous authority. "She can swim. Let her climb up. It's a lesson learned." The chief stopped, turning to face his commanding officer. "Sir, with all due respect, you just assaulted a woman on a naval base. You shoved her into the bay. I used proportional force to remove an obstinate civilian from a restricted area," Miller retorted, falling back on the sterile language of incident reports to shield himself from the reality of the situation. "She's fine." Down below, Kelly reached the ladder. The metal rungs were coated in sharp, calcified barnacles and slick, green algae. She reached out, her hands numbed by the cold water, and gripped the iron. The barnacles instantly sliced into her palms. She didn't flinch. She pulled herself up. Every rung was a battle against gravity and wet fabric. The fleece weighed 20 pounds soaked through. Her boots squeaked and slipped against the slime-coated iron. Blood from her lacerated palms mixed with the seawater, dripping quietly down into the bay. Kelly climbed in silence. Her mind was a terrifyingly calm place. She wasn't thinking about the pain in her hands. She wasn't thinking about the freezing wind cutting through her wet clothes. She was thinking about Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Failure to obey order or regulation. She was thinking about Article 128. Assault. She was drafting the end of Wyatt Miller's career with the precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. Up on the pier, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to toxic. The squad of SEALs remained by the boat, exchanging uneasy glances. They were trained to follow their officer, to back their brothers in a firefight. But this wasn't a firefight. This was a bully throwing a temper tantrum. Miller stood near the ladder, waiting. He tried to maintain a posture of authority, hands on his hips, but his fingers were twitching. A pair of hands gripped the edge of the concrete. They were shaking slightly, smeared with bright red blood. Miller took a half step back. Kelly hauled herself over the lip of the pier. She didn't roll gracefully. She dragged her body over the harsh concrete, getting to her knees, and then, slowly, standing up. Puddles of water instantly pooled around her boots. Her grey hair, previously tied back, was now plastered flat against her skull, dripping dark water down her pale face. She stood there, breathing heavily, bleeding, soaking wet, and she stared at Miller. "Ma'am, you need to leave the base," Miller said, his voice lacking any of its former thunder. He was trying to sound in control, but he sounded like a child who had broken a window and was trying to explain it away. "I suggest you head to the main gate." Kelly didn't move. She raised her right hand, inspecting the deep cuts across her palm. She squeezed her fist, letting the blood drip onto the concrete. Then, the sound of tires on wet pavement broke the silence. A dark blue Navy staff car, washed and polished to a mirror shine, rolled slowly down the length of Pier 4. It was flanked by a white base security patrol vehicle. The red and blue lights on the security truck were flashing silently in the fog. Miller's stomach plummeted. He recognized the staff car. Everyone on base recognized the staff car. The vehicles rolled to a halt 20 yards away. The doors opened. 2 armed master-at-arms stepped out of the security truck, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. From the back of the staff car stepped Captain David Owens, the base commander. He was in his service khakis, holding a tablet, looking deeply annoyed by the early hour. "What in the hell is going on here?" Captain Owens barked, striding toward the group. He saw the SEALs. He saw Miller. And then he saw the dripping, bleeding woman standing at the edge of the pier. Owens stopped dead in his tracks. The annoyance vanished from his face, replaced instantly by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The blood drained from his cheeks. Miller turned to the captain, standing at attention and offering a crisp salute. "Good morning, Captain. Lieutenant Miller, SEAL Team." Owens ignored the salute. He walked right past Miller, his eyes locked entirely on the soaking wet woman in the faded scrubs. Owens stopped 3 feet from Kelly. He snapped his heels together. His back went rigidly straight, and he threw a salute so hard and fast he nearly slapped his own forehead. "Admiral Kelly," Captain Owens said, his voice trembling slightly. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do we need a corpsman?" The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a submarine. Miller froze. His arm was still raised in his ignored salute. The words hit his brain, but they refused to process. "Admiral." Admiral Kelly, the chief, standing behind Miller, closed his eyes and slowly exhaled. He knew it. He knew she wasn't a contractor. Kelly returned the captain's salute slowly, deliberately, the blood from her hand running down her wrist. "I am fine, Captain," Kelly said. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of a sledgehammer. She turned her head, slowly shifting her gaze back to the 28-year-old lieutenant who had just thrown her into the ocean. Miller's face was the color of ash. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogance had been completely wiped from his features, replaced by a devastating, soul-crushing terror. He wasn't looking at a frumpy hospital worker anymore. He was looking at the Surgeon General of the United States Navy, a 3-star admiral. "Lieutenant Miller was just conducting a training exercise," Kelly said to the captain, her eyes never leaving Miller's pale face. "He was demonstrating the application of blind, unearned authority." She took a slow, squelching step toward Miller. She was 6 inches shorter than him, but right now she eclipsed the sun. "You wanted me off your pier, Lieutenant?" Kelly asked softly. Miller couldn't speak. He swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I didn't know." "Ignorance is not an excuse for assault, Lieutenant. It is a multiplier for it," Kelly said, her voice dropping into a deadly, freezing calm. "You didn't see a threat. You saw someone you thought you could break. You saw someone beneath you." She stopped right in front of him. "I spent 30 years putting boys like you back together when your egos wrote checks your armor couldn't cash," Kelly whispered, leaning in slightly. "You don't own this pier. You don't own the water. And as of 0550 this morning, you don't own that trident on your chest." Miller physically swayed. The words hit him harder than a physical blow. "Captain Owens," Kelly said, turning her back on Miller entirely. "Yes, Admiral," Owens barked. "Detain the lieutenant, confiscate his weapon, his ID, and confine him to quarters pending a court-martial." I, ma'am." Owens gestured to the master-at-arms. "Arrest him. As the security detail moved forward, grabbing Miller's arms, the SEAL did not resist. He let them take him. He just stared at the puddle of bloody water forming around the Admiral's boots. Kelly looked down at her ruined coffee cup, lying on the concrete. She sighed, the profound exhaustion of 3 decades of service settling back onto her shoulders. "I need a dry towel," she muttered, "and a better cup of coffee." The United States Navy does not process disgrace quickly. It grinds it down, atom by atom, through a bureaucratic machine built of carbon copy forms, sterile rooms, and suffocating protocol. Lieutenant Wyatt Miller sat in a windowless room inside the Naval Criminal Investigative Service Detachment building. The walls were painted a shade of institutional beige that somehow managed to absorb all light. He was no longer in his damp physical training gear. He wore a crisp, hastily pressed set of working khakis provided by a silent supply clerk. They were a size too large. The collar chafed his neck. Without his weapon, his radio, or his squad behind him, the uniform felt like a hollow shell. He stared at the metal table. His hands rested flat on the cool surface. They were the hands that had shoved a flag officer into the Pacific Ocean just 4 hours ago. Now, they were trembling. The heavy steel door clicked and pulled open. Commander Thomas Weaver walked in. Weaver was a judge advocate general with 20 years in the service, greying temples, and a face deeply lined by the exhaustion of defending and prosecuting the worst impulses of young men. He carried a thick manila folder. He didn't slam it on the table. He didn't bark. He just set it down quietly and took the seat across from Miller. Weaver opened the file. The silence in the room stretched out, taut and fragile. "I've spent the morning interviewing your squad," Weaver said. His voice was a dry, raspy baritone. Chief Harrison gave a sworn statement. He explicitly stated he warned you to stand down. He stated the civilian, the Admiral, was not acting in a threatening manner. He stated you initiated physical contact, escalated the encounter, and utilized excessive force. Miller swallowed. His throat felt full of sand. "He's telling the truth." Weaver paused, looking up from the paper. He studied Miller's face. There was no arrogance left. The apex predator who had owned Pier 4 at dawn was gone, replaced by a terrified kid realizing he had just detonated his own life. "Assault on a superior commissioned officer. Article 90, Weaver recited, his tone flat. Conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. Article 133, assault consummated by a battery. Article 128, reckless endangerment, dereliction of duty." Weaver closed the folder. The preliminary recommendation from the base commander is a general court-martial. You're looking at a maximum sentence that involves Fort Leavenworth, Wyatt, and the immediate forfeiture of your trident. Miller flinched. The threat of prison was terrifying, but the mention of his trident, the gold eagle, anchor, and trident pin that defined his entire existence, was a physical blow. "Sir, I didn't know who she was." "It doesn't matter who she was," Weaver snapped, a flash of genuine anger cutting through his cynical veneer. "If she had been a dependent spouse taking a morning walk, you'd still be sitting in this chair. You threw a human being into 15 feet of cold water because she didn't jump fast enough when you barked. The stars on her collar just mean the Navy is going to use a bigger hammer to crush you." Across the base, the hammer was refusing medical attention. Vice Admiral Patricia Kelly sat on a crinkly paper-lined examination table in the VIP ward of the Naval Medical Center. She had changed into a fresh uniform. Her wet hair had been blow-dried by an anxious aide and pulled back into a severe bun. A young hospital corpsman second class named Davies stood frozen in front of her, holding a suture kit. He was 21 years old and sweating profusely. "Breathe, Davies," Kelly said quietly. "It's just a hand. It's my hand, but the anatomy is standard." "Yes, Admiral." "Sorry, Admiral," Davies stammered. He swabbed the deep, jagged lacerations on her right palm with iodine. The barnacles had chewed through the epidermis, leaving ragged flaps of skin. 4O silk, Kelly instructed, her voice steady. "Interrupted stitches. Take your time. Don't rush the margins." She watched him work. feeling the sharp sting of the needle piercing her numbed skin. The physical pain was secondary. What gnawed at her was the sheer stupid waste of it all. Millions of dollars in training, years of selection, all to produce an operator who lacked the basic emotional regulation of a toddler. The door to the clinic opened. Rear Admiral Gregory Vance, the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, stepped inside. He was a surface warfare officer, impeccably dressed, radiating the polished anxiety of a man who managed optics for a living. "Patty," Vance said, glancing warily at the young corpsman sewing her hand. "Can we have the room?" "Davy stays. He's in the middle of a procedure," Kelly said without looking up. "What is it, Greg?" Vance sighed, stepping closer and lowering his voice. "The Pentagon is buzzing. Word got out before the sun was fully up. The base commander has Miller in custody. JAG is drafting the charge sheets." "Good, the system works. Patty, listen to me," Vance pleaded softly. "Miller is a Tier 1 operator. He has 2 Silver Stars. He pulled 3 Marines out of a burning Humvee in Fallujah when he was 22. He is a lethal, highly invested asset. We throw him to a general court-martial. The press gets hold of it. A SEAL attacking the Surgeon General. It's a circus." Kelly's left hand gripped the edge of the examination table. The knuckles went white. "Are you asking me to sweep an assault under the rug to protect the brand, Greg? I'm asking you to consider an admiral's mast. Non-judicial punishment. We strip his rank, pull his bird, and quietly separate him with an other-than-honorable discharge. We remove the cancer without putting the patient on the evening news. No." The word was absolute. It hung in the sterile air of the clinic. Vance frowned. "Patty—" "No," Kelly repeated, turning her head to lock eyes with the deputy chief. "He didn't make a tactical error, Greg. He didn't misread a target package. He used his physical superiority to terrorize someone he perceived as weak. If I let him walk away quietly, I am validating the exact culture that creates men like him. I am telling every nurse, every civilian contractor, every junior sailor on this base that if the guy assaulting them has a shiny enough resume, the rules don't apply." She winced slightly as Davies pulled a knot tight. "I am the Surgeon General," Kelly continued, her voice dropping to a gravelly register. "My job is to cut out infections. Lieutenant Miller is an infection. We will prosecute him in the light of day. Let the press have it. Maybe the next time a frogman decides he owns the concrete he walks on, he'll remember what happened to Wyatt Miller." Vance stared at her for a long moment. He recognized the immovable object in front of him. He nodded once, sharply. "I'll tell JAG to proceed." 2 months later, the damp heat of late summer baked the asphalt of Naval Base San Diego. Inside Courtroom B of the Navy Region Southwest Legal Service Office, the air conditioning hummed a steady, monotonous drone. The Article 32 preliminary hearing had been brief. The evidence was insurmountable. There was no defense strategy that could mitigate the sworn testimony of 7 SEALs, a base commander, and a 3-star admiral. Faced with the reality of his actions, Miller's defense counsel had brokered a pre-trial agreement, a guilty plea in exchange for capping his confinement at 3 years in military prison, followed by a dismissal, the officer equivalent of a dishonorable discharge. Today was the sentencing phase. Miller sat at the defense table. He wore his service dress blues. The brass buttons gleamed. The ribbons on his chest told a story of valor, foreign campaigns, and blood spilled in the dirt. Above the ribbons sat the gold trident. It felt impossibly heavy. The gallery behind him was mostly empty, save for a few JAG clerks and a solitary figure sitting in the back row. Chief Harrison, the man who had refused to lie for him. Miller hadn't spoken to his men since that morning on Pier 4. He had been isolated, radioactive. Looking at the chief now, Miller felt a sickening wave of shame. He hadn't just lost his career, he had lost his tribe. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Vice Admiral Patricia Kelly walked down the center aisle. She wore her summer whites. The 3 silver stars on her collar caught the fluorescent light. She walked with a slight stiffness, the residual ache of cold water and concrete still lingering in her joints. She took a seat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table. She did not look at Miller. She looked at the military judge, a stern-faced captain sitting behind the elevated bench. The judge reviewed the final paperwork, the scratch of his pen echoing in the quiet room. He looked up. "Lieutenant Miller, please rise." Miller stood. His legs felt hollow. He locked his knees to keep them from shaking. "The accused has pled guilty to all charges. Before this court hands down the agreed-upon sentence, Lieutenant, you have the right to make an unsworn statement. Do you wish to speak?" Miller's defense attorney, a sharp-featured lieutenant commander, nudged him under the table. They had rehearsed this. A brief apology, a mention of his combat record, a plea for mercy based on operational stress. Miller looked at his lawyer. Then he looked past the prosecution table and met Admiral Kelly's eyes. She was watching him. Her expression wasn't vindictive. It wasn't triumphant. It was the same clinical, dissecting look she had given him on the pier before he shoved her. The rehearsed words died in Miller's throat. He realized, with a sudden crushing clarity, that talking about his medals now would be an insult to them. "Yes, Your Honor," Miller said. His voice was hoarse, but it didn't break. He stepped away from the defense table, ignoring his lawyer's frantic whisper. He stood at attention, facing the judge. "I have spent my entire adult life learning how to be dangerous," Miller said, his voice echoing in the cold room. "I was taught that the trident meant I was the best. I mistook that to mean I was untouchable. I forgot that the only purpose of being dangerous is to protect those who aren't." He turned his head slowly, looking directly at Kelly. "I didn't shove an admiral into the water that day. I shoved a civilian, a woman I thought couldn't fight back. I used the power the Navy gave me to bully a stranger. There is no excuse for it. There is no combat trauma or fatigue that justifies it. I broke the core tenet of the oath I took." He turned back to the judge. "I don't ask for leniency, Your Honor. I am no longer fit to wear this uniform. I am ready for my sentence." The courtroom was utterly silent. Chief Harrison, sitting in the back, lowered his eyes, a tight swallow working in his throat. Admiral Kelly did not move. She simply stared at Miller, her face unreadable. The judge nodded slowly. "Your statement is entered into the record, Mr. Miller. This court sentences you to confinement for a period of 36 months. You forfeit all pay and allowances, and you are hereby dismissed from the naval service." The judge brought the gavel down. Crack. "Bailiff, take the prisoner into custody." Two military police officers stepped forward. One of them reached out, entirely professional, and placed a hand on Miller's shoulder. "Sir, if you'll come with us." Miller turned. As he walked toward the side door, his path took him within 3 feet of Admiral Kelly. He stopped. The MPs tensed, but Kelly held up a single hand, stopping them. She stood up. She looked at the gold trident pinned to his chest. "You survived Bud/S, Mr. Miller," Kelly said softly. Her voice meant only for him. "You survived Fallujah. You survived the water." She looked up into his eyes. "Now you have to survive yourself. I hope you find a way to do it." She didn't wait for his reply. She turned and walked down the center aisle, pushing through the heavy wooden doors and stepping out into the blinding San Diego sun. An hour later, Kelly was back at the Naval Medical Center. She was out of her dress whites and back in her faded blue scrubs. She stood at the scrub sink outside Trauma Bay 1. The water ran hot over her hands. She pushed the antibacterial soap deep into her skin, lathering up to her elbows. She looked down at her right palm. The stitches had been removed weeks ago, but a thick, jagged network of pink scars remained, cutting across the lifelines of her hand. The skin pulled tight when she closed her fist. It was a permanent reminder. The water was always cold, the concrete was always hard, and the machinery of the Navy would always chew up the people who forgot why they were built. She shut off the water with her elbow. She pushed through the swinging doors into the chaotic noise of the Trauma Bay, where a young sailor was bleeding, and got back to work. That's the reality of the uniform. Power isn't a weapon, it's a responsibility. The moment you forget that, you lose the right to wear it. If this deep dive into naval justice, bruised egos, and quiet authority struck a nerve, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that true leadership doesn't need to shout. Subscribe to the channel for more grounded, raw stories about human nature. Hit the bell icon. See you next time.